Greetings, campers. I am so glad to see you out in the green. I know sometimes it's hard to get out. Sometimes it's hard to just get up. Society can weigh you down. I know it does me from time to time. But the woods, they don't care if you showered or brushed your teeth today. And yes, hygiene is obviously good for you, but on those days when the weight is just too heavy, you can always go into the woods and you will always be welcome. The birds don't care if you combed your hair or styled it just so. Yes, it's good to practice hair care, but I personally know that sometimes the heaviness you feel can make something like that just too much to attempt. And you know, the squirrels and the rabbits and the other creatures, they don't judge you based on the color of your skin, whether you're male or female, gay or straight. In the forest, you are free to be yourself. So if you can make it out here in the green with me, then it is a good day. So ground yourself, take a few deep breaths, and know that you are a part of the green and you are always welcome. Happy camping, camper. Now, before we get this camping party started, I would like to give a shout out to some special campers in the making. Thomas, Wyatt, and Gideon. Hello, boys. Now, campers, if you're up for a change, let's head down to the southern part of Pennsylvania into Gettysburg. But don't worry, we will make our way back up to Ohio, as there are still plenty of ghost stories to share. But in Pennsylvania, there are over 16 million acres of forest land. That accounts for a total of 58% of that state is designated forest area. The largest being Sproul State Forest, which covers 305,450 acres. But first, let's throw in a little spooky history with this episode. If anyone was awake during history class, then the Battle of Gettysburg should sound familiar. One of the deadliest battles to have been fought. With so much fear, anxiety, bloodshed, and death occurring in Gettysburg, it should not come as a shock to know that ghostly sightings have been experienced here. These experiences started shortly after the war and have continued to this day. Like me, you are probably wondering, where can one stay while exploring some of our more macabre and historical landmarks? Well, campers, you actually have a number of options. There are full hookup sites that can be found close by to Gettysburg. Keep in mind, campers, that this is now a tourist attraction, so boondocking is not located close by. You will probably have to drive about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on where you're at, if you want to boondock. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, just a bit longer of a drive. Fortunately, when you do arrive, there are hiking trails that one can take to get to nearly all the spooky destinations. However, some of these hiking trails can be long, so prepare accordingly. Take water and something to eat. Now that we've gotten our campsite settled and the s'mores are a s'morin', let's share some ghost stories. Slaughter's Pen, which is just east of Devil's Den, is where on December 13th, 1862, nearly 5,000 soldiers were captured, wounded, or killed at the battlefield of Gettysburg. It was the bloodiest of civil wars, I am sad to say. So many lost their lives here, but at Slaughter's Pen, it was said that the ground could not even be seen, as it was covered in the blood of the dead and dying. Slaughter's Pen honestly only encompasses just a small portion of the entire battlefield, located just a short trek from Little Round Top. That trek from Little Round Top is known as the Valley of Death. Many of the dead were buried right where they lay, possibly right where you're hiking, while others were placed in hastily dug mass graves, right where you might be picnicking. and it wasn't soon after that the apparitions and spirits began to appear. But let's back up a bit, campers. As Devil's Den already had a reputation for spookiness. In fact, many of the early descriptions of Devil's Den were that it was desolate and ominous, and that it looked like a battle had already taken place. Even the name Devil's Den was already in place before the battle had occurred. Some say, without any real evidence, that a large indigenous battle had taken place there. Would you be one to think it was just a coincidence? As of today, many ghost seekers, and those not intending to seek out ghosts, report seeing orbs and images. We don't know exactly when, but a pair of local hunters had gotten lost in the woods near the rocky ridges one early morning. One of the hunters happened to look up and see a figure of a man standing on top of a boulder. Silently, he pointed with one hand in a direction. It turned out to be the direction the hunters needed to go, but when the hunters turned back to thank the man, he was gone. No sound was made, no rustling of leaves or parting of grass had been heard. Additional ghost stories that were reported back in the 1880s were of unnatural sounds being heard and odd apparitions being seen. People would hear gunfire and men shouting in the distance. If we fast forward to the 1970s, we have visitors having captured photographic evidence of odd mists, strange shadows, and orbs. When a woman stopped in at a forest ranger's post, she had an interesting story to tell. She reported while out taking photos, she had gotten the sense of someone standing behind her. As she turned, she described a hippie-type man with long, dirty hair, raggedy clothing, bare feet, and wearing a flappy hat. He pointed behind her and said, "What you are looking for is over there." The woman turned to see what he was pointing at, and when she turned back to question the man, he was gone. This was not the only time this hippie man was seen, as a month later, a man came into the same ranger station asking if the Devil's Den was in fact haunted. When the ranger asked why, the man said he had been taking pictures about a month ago, and when he was developing the photos, the image of a hippie-ish man appeared in the photo. No shoes, dirty looking, long hair, and a flappy hat. This man swears that when he was taking pictures, there was no hippie man to be seen. Now, some of you may be saying to yourselves, there were no hippies back in the 1880s during the Civil War, and technically, campers, that is true. But for argument's sake, let's take into account that these men fighting during the Civil War were from all over the country. Doesn't matter which side they were fighting for. Men from Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Ohio, New York, and yes, Pennsylvania, all these men traveled here. Not by FedEx, not by bus or Prius, no planes and no caravanning. These men had traveled for the most part by foot, and it is a pretty good assumption that many of them had worn through their shoes, hadn't had a shave or taken a bath in a good long while, and I doubt the latest hair trends were at the forefront of their minds. So in the 1970s, the best way to describe someone who fit that description was a hippie. Now, if you head just northwest of Devil's Den, you will come to a triangular field. Here you can still find evidence of burned and blackened stone, which is where Union soldiers were decimated by the Confederates. It took just over 2 hours, and today folks report hearing the cries and painful screams of those lost men. Some have even captured orbs inside the triangle. Since we are here on our historical camping journey, we might as well talk about Satch's Covered Bridge, built by David Stoner in 1852. During the Union and Confederate battle, this bridge was used by both groups. Unfortunately, it was also used to hang 3 young men. And let's be honest, most of the men fighting in this war were young boys, possibly teens even, some having no idea what they were getting into. Once they did, some, overcome with fear and shock, abandoned their posts. 3 young boys who were trying to evade death tried to hide themselves by wearing Union uniforms and even tried to march with the North across Satch's Bridge. Sadly, they were discovered, and as a way to teach other Confederates, the young boys were hung there on that bridge and left there as a warning to other Confederate troops passing by. It's a horrible thing, if you ask me. As of today, the bridge is captured in backdrop photos of family outings, weddings, and engagement photos, and many a fisherman like to cast their lures over the bridge. But when night comes, so does that hurtful history. Many witness apparitions of soldiers marching across the bridge, and headless soldiers are seen underneath the bridge in the water. There is a strong cigar smell that tells of imminent spirits nearby. And as with many other areas of Gettysburg, there is the distant yet ominous echoes of cannon and gunfire. Well, camper, while this fire winds down, let me share one more haunt. Can you guess what the next place is? I know with a city like Gettysburg, it can be a hard one to decide, but I'll end the suspense. It's the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Now, some say this is the most haunted of all the Gettysburg spots, and that may be. It is home to almost 4,000 Civil War graves. As you can imagine, burying all those dead was a feat, and it wasn't really something the men had bothered to put much effort into. And for those that had been buried, it was a hastily burial with less care than one would like to think. With the majority of the bodies having been left there in the warm spring of early April 1865, you can imagine the sight and the smell that came wafting off of them. When the spring rains and wind began bringing the smell of death to the town of Gettysburg, the people there began to worry about disease. It only took about 4 months, let me repeat that, 4 months before reburial started to take place. The Gettysburg National Cemetery was erected as a Union/federal burial place. But let's be honest, the bodies of the Confederates were not given much respect. So I am not surprised by the angry ghosts that reside there in that cemetery. Even when the Southern Veterans Society were allowed to begin their reburials in 1870, only 5 years later. If you're brave enough to walk the cemetery plot, be prepared for a lot of ghostly behavior. Orbs, musket fire, shouts and cries can all be heard in and around the cemetery. There is even video that can be viewed on YouTube of a New Jersey man capturing ghostly figures walking and hiding behind 2 cannons on the battlefield. I will post a link in this episode for you to decide for yourself. I did watch it, and I am a believer that what this man caught was no living person. Now, campers, I am a believer of spirits and otherworldly apparitions. I myself have had personal experiences with these spirits. I say this because you may not be aware that our own first president, George Washington, was even cited by the 20th Maine Division as they were approaching Gettysburg. It is reported that as the men reached a fork in the road, they were unsure which path to take. While they stood there, a tall, imposing figure wearing a tri-cornered hat and sitting atop horseback waved to them and told them to go to the right. Now the Union soldiers thought he was a Union general who just remarkably looked like their dead president. Be that as it may, the soldiers followed this man on horseback, and he led them to Little Round Top, where they took to battle against the Confederates. And that man on horseback, he disappeared. This ghostly encounter even reached President Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and it was Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, the division commander, who stated, "We know not what mystic power may be possessed by those who are now bivouacking with the dead. I only know the effect, but I dare not explain or deny the cause. Who shall say that Washington was not among the number of those who aided the country that he founded?" End quote. Like I said, campers, just as some people can be good or bad, the same can be said for spirits. I have met good ones and I've met bad ones. And I wonder, was this spirit actually the spirit of George Washington? Was he trying to aid the Union soldiers? Was he trying to bring an end to the war? Or was he trying to encourage as much death as he could before it ended? I'm curious, do you believe this was a beneficial spirit? A vengeful spirit, an evil spirit? Or was it some deity of war? What are your thoughts? I think it is apparent that when a place is given the names of Devil's Den and Slaughter Pen, you know for a fact that trauma has occurred. And sometimes that trauma leaves a mark that cannot be washed away or buried away. There is plenty more spookiness to discuss here, but as this fire is starting to die down and dwindle, I think we should call it a night, campers. Since this podcast is focused around camping, campfires, ghost stories, and legends, I would love to hear your own personal stories while out camping. Please feel free to send me your personal camping stories, and they may have a chance of being shared on the podcast. Names can, of course, be omitted or changed as per your request. Let's keep the tradition of campfire ghost stories alive. You can send your experiences via email to campfireghoststories8@gmail.com. That's campfireghoststories, the number 8@gmail.com. You can hop on over to my Instagram page at Campfire Ghost Stories to see some of the photos of Slaughter's Pen, the Devil's Den, and other pictures of the Battle of Gettysburg. Happy camping!